The gray waters of the English Channel lapped against the hulls of landing craft as they approached the French coast in the pre-dawn darkness of August 19th, 1842. Major John Hamilton Andrews of the Essex Scottish Regiment gripped his rifle tighter, watching the shadowy cliffs of Dieppe emerge through the morning mist. What was meant to be a bold demonstration of Allied strength would become one of the most catastrophic military operations in Canadian history. The raid on Dieppe, codenamed Operation Jubilee, represented the culmination of months of planning and political pressure. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his military advisors had conceived this amphibious assault as both a test of German coastal defenses and a morale-boosting victory for the Allies. The operation would involve over 6,000 men, predominantly from the 2nd Canadian Corps, supported by British commandos and a small contingent of American Rangers. According to military historian John Campbell's analysis in The Price of Experience, the raid was also intended to appease Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's demands for a second front in Western Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment had studied the intelligence reports repeatedly during the crossing. The plan called for simultaneous landings at multiple points along an 8-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. The main assault would target the port town of Dieppe itself, while flanking attacks would neutralize the coastal batteries at Bernaville and Varangeville. The Royal Regiment of Canada would assault the eastern headland, while the Essex Scottish would storm the western approaches as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon. The armada of landing craft, destroyers, and motor gunboats pressed forward through increasingly choppy waters. The Royal Air Force had promised overwhelming air support, with over 70 squadrons committed to the operation. Intelligence officers had assured the commanders that German resistance would be minimal, describing the coastal defenses as lightly held by second-rate troops. However, the reality awaiting the Canadian forces bore no resemblance to the optimistic briefings they had received. The Germans had spent 2 years fortifying the Dieppe sector as part of the Atlantic Wall. Concrete bunkers housed machine gun nests and anti-tank guns, while artillery pieces commanded every approach to the beaches. The supposedly weak garrison consisted of battle-hardened veterans from the 302nd Infantry Division, supported by elements of the 10th Panzer Division. At precisely 4:50 in the morning, the first landing craft grounded on the pebble beaches of Dieppe. What followed would challenge every assumption about amphibious warfare and extract a terrible price from the young men who had volunteered to serve their country. The lessons learned in blood on those beaches would ultimately shape the successful Allied landings in Normandy 2 years later. But that future vindication offered no comfort to the soldiers about to face the hurricane of German fire. The stage was set for a military disaster that would resonate through Canadian military history for generations to come. The grinding sound of landing craft keels scraping against the pebble beach was immediately drowned by the thunderous roar of German machine guns. Captain Dennis Whittaker of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry watched in horror as the first wave of Canadian soldiers stumbled from their boats directly into a carefully prepared killing field. The Essex Scottish Regiment, tasked with assaulting the main beach at Dieppe, found themselves trapped between the sea and an impenetrable wall of concrete and steel. The supposed element of surprise had been completely lost when advance units encountered a German convoy earlier that morning, alerting the entire coastal garrison to the impending attack. Now, every German position was fully manned and ready. Sergeant Jack Nisbet of the Royal Regiment of Canada barely made it 10 yards up the beach when machine gun fire from the eastern headland cut down half his section. Intelligence had dismissed as a minor obstacle proved impossible to cross quickly while carrying full battle equipment. Men struggled and stumbled, presenting perfect targets for the German gunners positioned in concrete emplacements that had been invisible in aerial reconnaissance photographs. The Royal Navy destroyers HMS Culpe and HMS Fernie attempted to provide supporting fire, but their 4-inch guns proved inadequate against the heavily reinforced German positions. The promised close air support from the Royal Air Force was largely ineffective, as the pilots could not distinguish between Canadian and German forces in the smoke and confusion of the battlefield. according to wartime correspondent Ross Monroe's first-hand account published in the Toronto Daily Star. The beach was a scene of indescribable carnage, with Canadian boys falling like wheat before the scythe. Lieutenant Colonel Dollard Menard of Les Fusiliers Montreuil faced an impossible situation as his men attempted to advance through the town streets. German snipers picked off his officers one by one, while machine gun positions established in upper-story windows commanded every intersection. The supporting Churchill tanks of the 14th Army Tank Regiment, which had finally managed to get ashore, found themselves trapped by concrete barriers and unable to climb the steep sea wall. On the flanks, the situation was equally desperate. The Royal Regiment of Canada, attacking the heavily fortified position at Puys, walked into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The narrow beach offered no cover, and German defenders had positioned their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire. Within minutes, the regiment had suffered over 90% casualties, with many men never making it off the landing craft. Major Brian McCool of the South Saskatchewan Regiment, fighting desperately to secure the bridges over the River Sea, realized that the entire operation was collapsing. Radio communications had broken down almost immediately, leaving isolated units to fight their own desperate battles without coordination or support. The German defenders, far from being the demoralized second-rate troops described in intelligence briefings, fought with professional skill and devastating effectiveness. By 7 o'clock in the morning, less than 3 hours after the first landings, it had become clear that Operation Jubilee was a catastrophic failure. The beaches were littered with Canadian dead and wounded, while the survivors huddled behind whatever cover they could find, pinned down by relentless German fire. The promised quick victory had become a nightmare of unprecedented proportions, and the order to withdraw had not yet been given. Amid the carnage and chaos of the Dieppe beaches, extraordinary acts of courage emerged from the darkest moments of the failed operation. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment would become the first Canadian to earn the Victoria Cross in the Second World War. But his heroism came at a terrible cost to his men and himself. At the Pourville landing site, Merritt's battalion had initially achieved some success, establishing a foothold on the western flank of the German defenses. However, their advance quickly stalled when they reached the bridges over the River Sea. German machine gun positions commanded the approaches, and every attempt to cross resulted in heavy casualties. It was here that Merritt demonstrated the leadership that would make him a legend. "Come on over. There's nothing to it," Merritt shouted to his men, as he personally led charge after charge across the bullet-swept bridge. Time and again, he exposed himself to enemy fire, rallying his soldiers and maintaining their fighting spirit even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. His Batman, Private Gordon Brown, later recalled that Merritt seemed to bear a charmed life, walking through machine gun fire that cut down men all around him on the main beach at Dieppe. Chaplain John, foot of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, made a decision that would define Canadian military chaplaincy for generations. Rather than remaining in relative safety with the command post, Foote moved among the wounded and dying soldiers scattered across the killing ground of Blue Beach. Under constant fire, he administered last rites, carried wounded men to cover, and provided comfort to soldiers facing their final moments. When the order finally came to evacuate, Foote had already been selected for withdrawal with other essential personnel. However, as he stood on the landing craft watching Canadian prisoners being marched away by their German captors, he made an extraordinary choice. Stepping back onto the beach, Foote told the naval officer in charge, "It seems to me the men ashore will need me far more than anyone in England will." He would spend the next 3 years in German prisoner of war camps, ministering to captured Canadian soldiers. Captain Dennis Whitaker of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry found himself commanding what remained of his company after his superior. Officers had been killed or wounded. Trapped in a small building near the casino, Whitaker organized a desperate defense with barely 24 men. They held their position for hours, fighting off repeated German attempts to dislodge them while providing covering fire for wounded comrades attempting to reach the evacuation boats. The Royal Air Force, despite facing overwhelming odds, fought with desperate courage to protect the trapped ground forces. Squadron leader Johnny Johnson of 610th Squadron engaged German fighters throughout the day, eventually shooting down several enemy aircraft while his own Spitfire sustained serious damage. The air battle over Dieppe would prove to be one of the largest aerial engagements of the war. With both sides suffering heavy losses, Medical Officer Captain Claire McEwen of the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps performed surgery under fire throughout the day, operating on wounded soldiers in a makeshift aid station established in a damaged building near the beach. With limited supplies and constant danger from enemy fire, McEwen and his team saved dozens of lives while working in conditions that would have challenged surgeons in the best-equipped hospitals. These acts of individual heroism could not change the outcome of Operation Jubilee, but they demonstrated the extraordinary character of the Canadian soldiers who fought and died on the beaches of Dieppe. As the morning sun climbed higher over the blood-soaked beaches of Dieppe, the full magnitude of the disaster became increasingly apparent to the Allied commanders offshore. Brigadier Sherwood Lett, commanding the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade, watched through binoculars from the headquarters ship HMS Calpe as his regiments were systematically destroyed by German defensive fire. The statistics were becoming grimmer by the hour. The Essex Scottish Regiment, which had landed with 553 officers and men, was virtually annihilated within the first 2 hours of the assault. Of the men who had crossed the English Channel the previous night, fewer than 50 would return to England unharmed. Similar casualties were mounting across all units involved in the operation. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, Canadian commander of Operation Jubilee, faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Radio communications with the beach had broken down almost completely, leaving him with only fragmentary reports of the situation ashore. What information he did receive painted a picture of unmitigated disaster. The main assault on Dieppe town had failed completely, with Canadian soldiers pinned down on the beaches by devastating German fire at 9 o'clock in the morning. Roberts made the agonizing decision to commit his reserves. The Fusiliers Montreuil and additional companies of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry were ordered to land in a desperate attempt to rescue their comrades and salvage something from the operation. This decision would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of the entire raid, as it essentially doubled the casualties without achieving any meaningful military objective. Lieutenant Colonel Dollard Menard led Les Fusiliers Montreuil onto the beach, knowing that they were walking into a slaughter. German defenders had had hours to perfect their defensive positions and register their weapons on every possible landing site. The French-Canadian regiment advanced with remarkable courage into what they knew was almost certain death. Menard himself was severely wounded, but continued to lead his men until he lost consciousness from blood loss. The supporting naval forces found themselves increasingly helpless as the morning progressed. The destroyer HMS Barclay, attempting to provide close fire support, was bombed by German Junkers 88 dive bombers and had to be scuttled to prevent her capture. Other vessels in the fleet came under sustained attack from both air and shore-based artillery, limiting their ability to evacuate the growing number of casualties. Wing Commander Adrian Warburton, flying reconnaissance missions over the battlefield, reported back to headquarters that the beaches were covered with Canadian dead. His aerial photographs, later analyzed by intelligence officers, revealed the extent of the carnage and the complete failure of the assault to achieve any of its objectives. The German defenses had not only held, but had inflicted casualties at a rate that shocked even experienced military commanders. By mid-morning, it had become clear that further reinforcement would only increase the casualty toll without changing the outcome. The harsh reality was that Operation Jubilee had failed completely, and the only remaining question was how many more Canadian soldiers would die before the evacuation could be completed. The beaches that were supposed to serve as stepping stones to victory had become a graveyard for an entire generation of young Canadian men. According to a classified report later, released by the Department of National Defense, the casualty rate for Canadian forces at Dieppe exceeded 80%, making it one of the bloodiest single-day actions in Canadian military history. The order to withdraw came at 11:30 in the morning, But for many Canadian soldiers, trapped on the beaches of Dieppe, evacuation would prove as dangerous as the initial assault. Major Charles Cornelius Merritt, still fighting desperately to hold the bridge at Pourville, knew that retreat across the fire-swept beach would cost more lives than his battalion could afford to lose. The evacuation boats faced a gauntlet of German artillery and machine gun fire as they approached the beaches. Landing craft Tank 124, attempting to rescue survivors from the Essex Scottish Regiment, took direct hits from German anti-tank guns positioned on the cliffs above the beach. The craft burst into flames, taking with it the last hope of rescue for many of the wounded Canadian soldiers lying among the pebbles. Sergeant Major Stuart Henderson of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry took charge of organizing the withdrawal. From the main beach, most of his officers dead or wounded, Henderson moved among the scattered groups of survivors, coordinating their movement toward the evacuation points while maintaining covering fire against German positions. His leadership during those critical hours would later earn him the Distinguished Conduct Medal, but at a personal cost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The German defenders, recognizing that the Allied forces were attempting to withdraw, intensified their fire. Machine gun positions that had conserved ammunition during the morning, assault now opened up with devastating effect on the crowded landing craft and the soldiers struggling to reach them. The narrow beach offered no protection, and many men were cut down within sight of rescue. Flight Lieutenant Hugh Godefroy of 401st Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, made repeated strafing runs against German positions in an attempt to suppress enemy fire during the evacuation. His Spitfire was hit multiple times by anti-aircraft fire, but he continued his attacks until his ammunition was exhausted. The air cover provided by pilots like Godefroy was the only thing that prevented the evacuation from becoming a complete massacre. Medical orderlies worked frantically to get wounded men onto the evacuation craft, often under direct enemy fire. Corporal Frederick Topham of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, though not originally assigned to the Dieppe operation, had volunteered to serve with the medical teams. He repeatedly exposed himself to German fire while carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Actions that would later earn him the Victoria Cross in a different battle. Captain Hugh Halliday of the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve commanded motor, Launch 523 during the evacuation. Despite his vessel taking multiple hits from German shore batteries, Halliday managed to rescue 47 Canadian soldiers from the beach before his craft became too damaged to continue operations. His seamanship and courage under fire exemplified the dedication of the naval personnel who risked their lives to save as many soldiers as possible. By early afternoon, it had become clear that no more evacuation attempts could be made without unacceptable losses to the rescue craft. Hundreds of Canadian soldiers remained trapped on the beaches, either too badly wounded to move or pinned down by German fire. These men would face capture and, for many, years in German prisoner of war camps. The final tally of the evacuation would show that less than half of the Canadian forces that had landed that morning made it back to England. Of those who did return, many were wounded and would never see active service again. The young men who had crossed the English Channel with such high hopes the previous night were coming home as casualties of one of the most disastrous military operations in Canadian history. For the hundreds of Canadian soldiers who could not be evacuated from the beaches of Dieppe, August 19th. 1942 marked the beginning of a different kind of ordeal. Private Ronald Reynolds of the Royal Regiment of Canada lay wounded among the bodies of his comrades. Listening to the sound of German voices growing closer as enemy soldiers moved across the battlefield, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt, his heroic leadership at Pourville, found himself among the captured when ammunition ran low and further resistance became impossible. The Germans, recognizing his rank and the respect shown by his men, treated him with the formal courtesy typically accorded to captured officers. However, this civilized treatment would not extend to all prisoners, particularly after the discovery of what appeared to be commando-style equipment and orders among the Canadian forces. The German response to the Dieppe raid revealed both the professionalism and the brutality of the Wehrmacht. Oberst Heinrich Hammann, commanding the 302nd Infantry Division, initially ordered that wounded prisoners be given medical treatment according to the Geneva Convention. German medical personnel worked alongside captured Canadian medics to treat the hundreds of wounded soldiers scattered across the beaches. However, the discovery of orders instructing Canadian soldiers to bind prisoners led to a dramatic change in German policy. Adolf Hitler, upon learning of these instructions, issued the infamous Commando Order, declaring that captured special forces and their equipment should be turned over to the SS for interrogation. This order would have deadly consequences for future Allied operations and represented a significant escalation in the brutality of the war. Chaplain John Foote, who had chosen to remain with his captured comrades rather than accept evacuation, became a source of strength and comfort for the Canadian prisoners. His presence among the captured soldiers provided not only spiritual support but also practical assistance in dealing with their German captors. Foote's ability to speak some German helped in negotiations for better treatment of the wounded and dying. The march from the beaches to temporary holding areas was an ordeal in itself for many wounded prisoners. Private James Anderson of the South Saskatchewan Regiment, suffering from multiple shrapnel wounds, supported by his unwounded comrades during the long walk to the prisoner collection point. German guards, many of whom were veterans of the Eastern Front, showed varying degrees of humanity toward their captives. At the interrogation centers established by German intelligence, captured Canadian officers faced intensive questioning about Allied plans and capabilities. Major Brian McCool of the Essex Scottish Regiment underwent days of interrogation, during which German officers expressed genuine surprise at the quality and determination of the Canadian forces they had faced. The respect was mutual, as many Canadian prisoners commented on the professional competence of their German captors. The wounded Canadian soldiers presented a significant problem for the German medical services, which were already stretched thin by casualties from other fronts. German military hospitals in the region were forced to accommodate hundreds of Allied wounded, leading to overcrowded conditions and limited medical supplies. Despite these challenges, many Canadian lives were saved by German medical personnel who adhered to their professional obligations, regardless of nationality. As the prisoners were processed and prepared for transport to permanent camps in Germany, the full magnitude of the Canadian losses became apparent to both captors and captives. Entire companies had been wiped out, with survival often dependent on pure chance rather than skill or courage. The bonds formed among the survivors during those first days of captivity would endure. Throughout their years in German prison camps and beyond, the troop ships returning to English ports carried with them not only the survivors of Operation Jubilee, but also the harsh lessons written in Canadian blood on the beaches of Dieppe. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lemallory, reviewing the after-action reports in his headquarters, understood that the disaster had taught the Allies more about amphibious warfare than any successful operation could have provided. The statistical analysis of the Dieppe raid painted a stark picture of military failure. Of the 4,963 Canadian soldiers who had participated in the operation, only 2,210 returned to England, and many of these were wounded. 907 had been killed, and 1,946 were now prisoners in German hands. The Royal Canadian Air Force had lost 106 aircraft, while the Royal Navy had seen one destroyer sunk and numerous smaller vessels damaged or destroyed. Major General John Hamilton Roberts faced a board of inquiry that would examine every aspect of the failed operation. The questions were brutal and necessary. How had intelligence so completely misassessed German defensive capabilities? Why had the preliminary bombardment been cancelled? What had gone wrong with communications and coordination? Roberts, Carrion. The weight of responsibility for the disaster provided honest testimony that would help shape future Allied operations. The medical lessons learned at Dieppe proved particularly valuable. Lieutenant Colonel Clare McEwen's reports on battlefield surgery under fire led to significant improvements in field medical procedures. The experience of treating massive casualties under combat conditions informed the development of new surgical techniques and the organization of medical support for future amphibious operations. These innovations would save thousands of lives during the Normandy landings 2 years later. Wing. Commander Johnny Johnson's analysis of the air battle over Dieppe revealed critical flaws in the coordination between air and ground forces. The inability of aircraft to effectively support troops on the beach led to new tactics and communication procedures that would prove essential during the D-Day landings. The sacrifice of the Royal Canadian Air Force pilots over Dieppe contributed directly to Allied air superiority in subsequent operations. The intelligence failures at Dieppe prompted a complete reorganization of Allied reconnaissance and assessment procedures. The underestimation of German defensive capabilities and the failure to identify key strong points led to new methods of photo interpretation and the development of specialized reconnaissance units. Beach obstacles, defensive positions, and troop strengths would be assessed far more carefully in future operations. Perhaps most importantly, Dieppe demonstrated the absolute necessity of overwhelming fire support for amphibious operations. The inadequate naval bombardment and limited air support had left Canadian soldiers to assault prepared positions with nothing but their personal weapons and courage. Future operations would feature massive preliminary bombardments and close air support that could suppress enemy fire during the critical landing phase. The human cost of these lessons could never be forgotten or minimized. In towns and cities across Canada, families mourned sons, fathers, and brothers who had died on the beaches of Dieppe. The Essex Scottish Regiment was virtually destroyed as a fighting unit, requiring complete reconstruction. The Royal Regiment of Canada faced similar devastation, with entire companies wiped out in a matter of hours. Yet from this tragedy came the knowledge that would make D-Day possible. General Dwight Eisenhower, planning the invasion of Normandy, studied the Dieppe reports extensively and implemented the lessons learned at such terrible cost. The successful Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, succeeded in large part because of what had been learned from the failure at Dieppe. The veterans who survived Dieppe carried their experiences forward into subsequent operations, their hard-won knowledge proving invaluable in training new soldiers and planning new assaults. The price paid on August 19, 1942, helped ensure that future Canadian soldiers would not face the same hopeless odds that had confronted the men on the beaches of Dieppe. Today, the Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery stands as a permanent reminder of the sacrifice made by those young Canadians who died so far from home. Their legacy lives not only in the memory of their courage, but in the military lessons that helped secure ultimate Allied victory in the Second World War.